Topic first. Russia at the beginning of 20th century. Revolution and reforms. The situation in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. A country of contradictions. The first revolution of 1905-1907. Stolypin agrarian reform. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was a country of contradictions and shortcomings. Defeat during the Crimean and the Russian-Japanese wars, territorial losses in the Far East, consolidation of Russia's role in the world market only as an exporter of raw materials and food, growing financial dependency of development countries, and intensified rivalry with numbers of countries in the regions adjacent to Russia, signals that indicated dangerous trends. It was necessary to industrialize the country, restructure the agricultural sector, carry out a cultural revolution. Scientists, specialists, workers were needed, democratize all aspects of public life, create a legal democratic state, expand the rights and freedom of individuals, and resolve the national questions. The Russian Empire adopted from the West advanced forms of production organization, trusts, cartels, syndicates, machinery, airplanes, automobiles, cutting machine, automatic weapons, and ideals and concepts of social development, democracy and socialism. However, the gap between the most advanced and the most backward traditional institution, absolute monarchy, lack of multi-party system and parliament, and relation, feudal structure of agrarian relations, unitary treasury, widened. Tensions grow. The question of possible and necessary price of rapid progress naturally arose. The sharpest contradictions were between peasants and landowners, hired workers and entrepreneurs, the city and the village, the center and outskirts, different confession, Russians and the representatives of other people, and outskirts themselves, and the Cossacks and the groups of the population adjacent to them. But the central one was the increasing obviously gap between the autocratic form of government and the interests of progressive strata of population. The entire rich spectrum of conflicting interests was represented by various parties and public organizations, from monarchists and black hundreds to liberal democrats, left-wing radical and extremists. National organizations were absolutely widely represented among them. The scale of all these rape and party override problems was not the same. The goal and ideals of struggle were seen as different, and the methods and means of achieving them were sometimes opposite. With all the differentiety of ripe social and other conflicts, several stood out among them, creating special broad streams of public activity. The main question of Russian, by general recognition, remained the agrarian question, around the solution of which the agrarian peasants' revolution unfolded. It had its actors, its special social interest, political organization. The land questions was considered in the program documents of most parties, but especially the populist social revolutionary trends, ideology and ideals. The intensity of peasant uprising ultimately determined the temperature of opposition sentiments in the country. As the country industrialized, the workers relying on the poor strata, hired workers in the village and became organizationally and ideologically united. The proletarian poor peasant stream emerged as a relatively independent one. The national liberalization movement grew just as quickly. During the war, an anti-war movement was formed in which representatives of various strata of the population participated. The most active, offensive, massive and organized was the public movements united under the flag of democratization, a change in the political regime, and the establishment of constitutional order. Each of these large streams, in turn, relied on the various strata that hoped to implement their specific programs. The peasants was divided into the well-to-do, the middle peasants, and the poor. The working class was just as a heterogeneous, dependent on the profession, qualifications, wages, and connection with the village. The composition of a national liberation movement was motley. All this opposition revolutionary forces together overloaded society with the moods of disconnect, uncertainty, despair, and readiness for open combat. Foreign experiences in solving present social problems was actively discussed and adopted. The First Russian Revolution. Revolution of 95th, 97th organically fit into the world revolutionary process. The peculiarity of Russian was not that Tsarist governments, forced to carry out capitalist industrial reforms in content and direction, carried out their evolution of the political system extremely slowly. The aggravation of the political crisis in Russia and the approach of revolution were facilitated by the world economic crisis 1993 and Russian-Japanese War 1904-95. During the economic crisis, up to 3,000 industrial enterprises closed in the country and other 200,000 people were left without work. This gave rise to the enormous wave of strike and demonstration. The absolute monarchy tried to prevent the brewing revolution with a small victorious war, but the Russian-Japanese War that began in 1904 only aggravated the crisis. The country was poorly prepared for it and its troop suffered one defeat after another. Poverty and lack of rights in the village frequently crop failures, and mass famine intensified peasants' protest against the existing system. Under the influence of the protest, opposition also decreased on the part of democratic intelligence. The beginning of the Russian Revolution was the events of Bloody Sunday on January 9, 1905. The shooting by troops of a 150-strong peaceful demonstration of St. Petersburg workers on Palace Square. The task of revolution, the overthrow of autocracy, the resolution of agrarian question and the establishment of democracy republic were bourgeois, and they were carried out by democratic forces, the proletariat, the peasantry, and the democratic strata of intelligence. Several stages are distinguished. The first, January 9, September 5th, were beginning on the revolution. The strike movements of the workers is growing and the 5th Soviets of Workers' Deputy are created. Initially, they arise as organ of strike struggle and then turn into revolutionary organs of power. The peasant movement is expanded. Peasant uprising took place in Ukraine, Baltic and Georgia. In the summer 1905, the All-Russian Peasant Union was created, 200,000 people. Revolutionary events had in the army and the navy. Prince Potemkin Tavritsky, the great ship. Manifest October 17 was published. The second stage is the highest peak of revolution. In October, individual political action of workers grew into the all-Russian political strike, in which over 2 million people took part. The culmination of this stage was a December armed uprising in Moscow. And the third stage, January 96, June 3, 97, was a period of decline. Nevertheless, at this stage, many workers, sailors, soldiers and peasants continued the struggle. On June 3, 1907, a manifest was published on the dissolution of Second Duma and the change in the electoral system. The manifest of October 17, 1905, contained the following provisions: granting civil and political freedoms, speech, assembly, unions, the creation of an elected supreme representative body of power, the State Duma. It must have a legislative character. After the manifest was published, the government began to be reorganized, and the Council of Ministers became a permanent government institution. The Council was charged with directing and unifying the actions of all departments on issues of legislation and the higher government administration, and it was established that bills could not be submitted to the State Duma without government discussion in the Council of Ministers. The manifest of October 17 initially caused general jubilation. Some liberals refused to continue the struggle. However, the unrest didn't stop. At the same time, it was both revolutionary and anti-revolutionary in nature. Some governors were stunned by the manifest. Extremely right-wing political organization, the Black Country, staged pogroms. With the publication of the manifest, legal political parties began to appear in the country. The manifest is not a law, but only an announcement on intent, many of which were not confirmed later. All the changes made were the record in the fundamental laws of 1906. Speaking about the reasons of the defeat of the revolution, the following can be highlighted. The autocracy was still quite strong. The army as a whole was on the side of Tsarism. Second, reformist course of liberal opposition take place and which enabled to become in the fight against the absolute monarchy. 3. There was a lack of organization and unity of action among the most active forces of revolution. 4th, the lack of unity between the left forces and parties representative them, which had different visions of the revolution itself and the task facing it, had negative impact on the courses of revolution. And 5, the defeat of the revolution was also facilitated by the system of international capital. France, Germany, Japan helped to defeat the revolution. The first Russian Revolution had a great influences on the subsequent development of both Russian and many other countries. Despite the defeat of the revolution, the working class achieved a number of political economic concessions. The average wage of workers increased by more than 10%, working conditions improved, the working day was shortened, and it became possible to unite in trade unions and other unions. B. Emperor was forced to begin agrarian reform. C. The terms of military service in the army was shortened. D. Freedom of religions. E. Highest representative body, the State Duma, was created. On June 3, 1907, manifest on the dissolution of the state's second State Duma and the changes in the electoral law was announced. The new regulation on election followed without the approval of the Duma, which contradicted the basic law. The democratic part of society assessed the past as a cope did it. The new election system changed the balance of power in Duma in favor of landowners and big bourgeoisie. The innovation affected the peasantry especially strongly, the number of electors from which was reduced from 42 to 22. The right of the outskirts of the Russian Empire, Poland, Caucasus, Central Asia were curtailed. In Europe, Russian elected 403rd deputy to Duma, then Asian Russian only 15. Stolypin agrarian reform. The revolution of 1905-1907 once again raised the agrarian question in all its acuteness. Peasants uprising and unrested, about 16,000 landowners' estates were burned and looted, became the background against which political struggle unfolded. The Russian monarchy was forced to make serious changes. The main and fundamental task of agrarian reform was the fundamental reorganization of the land use and land ownership of the peasantry. The system of communal land ownership. The community regularly redistributed land between peasants' farms in accordance with the size of family, number of workers, and the size of taxes. The high birth rate was the reason the constant shortage of land allotments in the central provinces of Russia. Since 1893, redistribution were allowed to be carried out no more often than every 12 years. The desire to equalize the economic usefulness of a plot allocated to each individual farms led to the unfavorable phenomenon of strip land ownership. The meaning of strip land ownership is that all the lands of the community are cut into several large plots. With each of these, the land is considered to be of the same quality, and each plot of the land is cut into narrow strip according to the number of farms. The area of a strip is proportional to the number of workers. Peasants had to cultivate up to 30 land fields scattered across different places, which had an extremely unfavorable effect on the efficiency of agriculture. The state in most cases deal only with the rural community as a whole. The amount of taxes and municipal fees was calculated for the community. All members of a rural community were bound for municipal responsibility. The community bore collective responsibility for the payment of all types of taxes and redemption payment by all its membership. Form of land ownership characterized by the ownership of certain land plot by peasant community was outdated. Peasant community, or mir, is a unit of administrative and economic self-government of peasant and Russian Empire. The village meeting in the organ of peasant self-government. It united all peasants' householders and elected the village elder and other officials. The village meeting was subject to all matter related to the communal use of mere land, land redistribution, determination of rulers, sales, purchases, and so on. The fight against strip farming by means of a complete distribution of communal and land became one of the main tasks of the agrarian reform of Minister Internal Affairs Stolypin. The most important task of reform was relieve the social tension in the village and create a support base for the authorities in the form of broad layers of a peasantry. In practice, the agrarian reform included a number of major measures defined by the Legislative Act 1906-1911. The decree November 9, 1996 testified to the fact that the authorities had abandoned the old policy of preserving the community and had moved to the supporting the small private owner. The main components of Stolypin agrarian reform were: first, permission for peasants to leave the community by allocating own plot, so-called kat, otrup, to each household. A peasant who left the community became a private owner of the land with the village without moving the estate in the case of an kat. A kat is the most compact arrangement of land. A farmstead is an isolated peasant farm, outside the village without connection with the community. Several households with separate land ownership formed a farmstead. In the case of farmstead, there were new undeveloped land. Stolypin often mixed the concept in his lawmaking. Second, compulsory land measurement. If peasants declared his desire to leave the community, then, despite the objection of the village assembly, the land management commissions consolidated the peasants' land plots into one place. Straightening the peasant bank, which provided low-interest loan to the peasants who had separated from the community on preferential terms with payment differences from up to 50 years. Resettlement policy. It's one of the most important and one of the most interesting measures of Stolypin's reform. The reform unfolded in favored conditions. The agricultural crisis in Europe had ended. Since 1907, redemption payment, which had been a heavy burden on peasants' farmers, were abolished. The government intensified the activities of a peasant bank, to which landowners, Russian nobles, frightened by the agrarian pogroms, sold their estates after 1950s. The peasant bank curated about 4 million desitin. It's a Russian unit of land area, especially about 1 hectare of land, which was sold or leased to peasants in need. The most important part of the agrarian reform was a resettlement policy. In a short period of time, 1906-1914, more than 3 million families, it's about 12-15 million people, moved to the new lands in Siberia, Caucasus, Kazakhstan and the Far East and developed 30 million desitins of land. The resettlement was carried out with the state support. The treasury paid for the transportation of people and their property. The state carried out work to create infrastructure of new lands. Schools, roads, medical stations were built. The land plots of the settlers were significantly larger than in Europe, Russian. In new lands, large, highly commercial peasants' farm grew up in a short period of time. Siberia not only began to feed itself, but also to export significant amounts of agricultural products, grain, oil, to Europe, part of Russia and abroad. The grain harvest in 1913 was about 1/3 higher than in the USA, Canada and Argentina combined. The country exported 10-11 million tons of grain annually, which is approximately half of all its world exports. Stolypin agrarian reform was not easy. The difficulties in its implementation were associated with many reasons. The lack of funds allocated by the state for the reforms had an effect. There was an acute shortage of people capable and willing to implement it. Nevertheless, the reform was the most effective of all the agrarian reforms that were carried out in Russia before and after. Another important result of Stolypin agrarian reform was the growth of a cooperative movement in the Russian village. Cooperatives were created for the sale of agricultural products, their primary processing, the purchase of industrial goods, including machinery, In direct connection with agricultural reform, Stolypin developed and began to implement other reforms to expand the representative of peasants in zemstvo institution, improve legal procedure, and introduce compulsory, universal, and free primary education. The reforms carried out by Stolypin's government and he himself were subject to sharp attacks from both the left and the right. The Socialist Party, without denying the economic feasibility of reforms, were afraid of losing the social base of the revolution in the village and focused their criticism on the social side of issues. The right-wing reactionary force saw them as dangerous to the five representatives, especially activity opposition, the reforms of local government and the court. There was strong resistance from below disconnect in the communities. The tendency of a communal order, its inherent leveling, had an effect. Here, in the southern and southeastern provinces, the widespread distribution of farmstead was hampered by difficulties with the water. But where in the North Caucasus, in the steppe Trans-Volga region and the northern Black Sea region, the planting of cuts developed quite successfully. The fertile steppe, flat as a table, was created for the cut farming. In the central Black Earth provinces, the main obstacles to the formation of farmstead and cuts on communal lands was the peasants' shortage of land.